By the time I'm finished, you may feel that this isn't just a talk about America and American studies, but also a kind of intergalactic body of reference. I need almost to invoke that wonderful film that was made by Mel Brooks many years ago called The History of the World, Part 1. And the number of writers and names I want to mention may be a little bit dazzling, but that is the nature of the field. Now, we have in this title, Writing Multicultural America, the powers of Canon and ethnicity, a huge mouthful of terms, all of which need some gloss, some kind of construing. So let me start with these terms. And the first of these terms is America itself. America, America, America. That one word as a kind of nomenclature which itself has settled into canonical usage. It means North America, the United States of America, the USA, the US. It incorporates what those early Europeans were involved with when they thought they were going to map themselves onto the landmass, which today we recognize as North America. New England, Nouvelle-France, Nueva España, New York, Nova Scotia, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New Orleans, New Sweden. That notion somehow that the landmass was going to be rewriting the Europeans. And over the 400 years that were to follow, a build-up took place whereby America became institutionalized in a term which Walter Lippmann, a very powerful and useful political commentator who published a book called Public Opinion in 1922, he called it the manufacture of consent. The manufacture of consent. This is consensual America. This is what America is. And America is English-speaking, white, Christian, mainly Protestant, nuclear familied, heterosexual, and happily suburban. That is institutional America. That's America. Which brings up the next question of what we've come to call cultural whiteness. It's a white country. And when we look at that cultural whiteness, and I'm not talking about the color of skin, I'm talking about cultural whiteness, what it means. A useful annotation comes from the critic Valerie Babb, who in 1998 wrote a book called Whiteness Visible, The Meaning of Whiteness. And she says the following: whiteness is a created identity, sustained through hegemony, a complex network of cultural relations, including, among other things, literature, museums, popular culture, and movies. And of course, very quickly we can put a gloss on that. Just think about it. The founding patriarchs of America, that first family, George and Martha Washington, the whitest of white families that ever existed. And it goes on through to the Bushes, father and son, Barbara and the offspring, even through to Jeb, who's now white in Florida. Think too of the Daughters of the American Revolution, DAR, or even more telling, the Daughters of the American Confederacy, white ladies keeping white America white and keeping it white against all comers at all times. Anybody off color is out. Think of the commotion recently that took place when the scholar Shelley Fisher Fiskin wrote a book called Was Huck Black? Because it turned out that Twain had borrowed a great deal of black dialect to feed into the voice of Huckleberry Finn. Think of those screen cowboys, John Wayne. Was there ever a whiter white man? I doubt it. Think of those screen goddesses from Jean Harlow, who in her time in the 30s was known as the blonde bombshell, through to Marilyn. And think of the kind of whiteness which, of course, could lead to fundamentalist zealotry and racism, which began with, or didn't begin with, but certainly institutionalized itself in the Ku Klux Klan. and in D.W. Griffiths' Birth of a Nation, in which all black people were played by white people wearing blackface. Think of Gone with the Wind. Frankly, madame, I don't give a dear, as somebody once said. Was there a whiter film for the 1930s and 40s? I doubt it. And more recently, from our language pals, we've had two movements called English Only and Official English. Now, both of these are to make sure that people who are not born to native speaking of English are somehow kept at bay. Otherwise, rap, black English, Latino English, Asian English are going to ruin the state of America. It is one of the most veiled racist outfits imaginable, and yet it has the following of some very distinguished names. And how, too, do we actually deal with the fact that America has always been a mix of ethnic ancestries? And if that is not the case, shall I simply mention the name of the current president? It is one thing to say he's an African American, it's another thing to say that he is a mixed race president. The latter is actually the case, since he had a Scottish American mother. What America doesn't mean is South America. So the arrogance of appropriating that word for America should be self-evident. It slides over the whole issue of Native America, Indigenous America, America that was there before America was there. It slides over African America, it slides over Hispano-America, it slides over Asian America, it slides over all of the minorities, it slides over LBGT America, and feminist America, and transgender America, and disablement America. It's just one America, the one I started with. It doesn't even address the plurality of white ethnicities. And here again, one would like to know that WASP America is but one inflection of ethnicity, only one. It deals with and is on a spectrum with what has been condescendingly called white trash, with German American America, with Scandinavian American America, with Jewish America, with Irish America, with Mediterranean America. And I remind you that in the 19th century, Irish America and Italian and Greek America were not considered white Americans. And there's been a body of studies on this. People like, for example, Matthew Jacobson, writing on Jewish America, with a great title called Whiteness of a Different Color. Lovely title. And Noel Ignatieff, who wrote the book How the Irish Became White, which is an interesting story too. Now, the second term is canon and canonicity. Who chooses what makes for a canon? How historically determined are canons? Would it be the case, and I say this with our esteemed president sitting here, that even the 4 Christian Gospels were chosen from 60 others, which created the canon? And if we were Victorians, we would read in our poetry Tennyson and Browning. They were the canon. Are they the canon today? I'm sure you all reach for your Tennyson and Browning nightly as you look to go into the land of slumber. And if you want to trace the evolution of that, look at the most famous anthology taught in the United States, the Norton Anthology. Go back to its late 1950s appearance, trace it through when there was barely a person not white in the early Norton anthologies to what is now multicultural anthologies throughout the state. And that brings us to the fighting ground, to the time for a bit of battling, for the time now to start the argument, multiculturalism. It is a term in which fists are raised. It is a term in which the state is threatened. And yet, there it is, the very DNA of America. Even Time magazine, that dreadful affliction on the human soul, was able to say in the 1990s, in a review of Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club, one of the great Chinese-American novels, growing up ethnic is surely the liveliest theme to appear in the American novel since the closing of the frontier. Good spotting, Time magazine. Amazing that somehow Time magazine had suddenly created a recognition of multicultural America. Remember, who founded it were 2 of the whitest people in America, namely Henry Luce and Claire Booth Luce, who gave you the great anti-communist tirade in order to preserve the state. Eric Liu a very, very powerful Chinese-American autobiographer in a lovely book called The Accidental Asian, Notes of a Native Speaker, attacks the model minority model completely, and he says the following: times have changed, and I suppose you would call it progress, that a Chinaman too may now aspire to whiteness. It's a nice comment in all kinds of ways. So let's talk a little about this canon before we go too much further. I don't particularly want to talk about the culture wars of the 1960s. Those have been aided very ably by my predecessor here and also by many, many people. So I think we'll talk sex. This, I think, seems to me the appropriate thing at this point, and it's fairly early in the morning, so we could get a little sex in before we finish. I want to quote to you an English writer of the 17th century, John Donne, one of the great metaphysical English poets, and in his poem, To His Mistress Going to Bed. Useful title. One not to be read to the children, of course, for fear of contamination. And this is one of the most famous lines. He says the following: license my roaming hands and let go before, behind, between, below. Oh, my America, my newfound land. And here in a marvelous poem, we have the precursor to what the historians have called American exceptionalism. My newfound land. Here is the Adamic place. Here is the redemptive place. It's Atlantic. It is redemptive. It is a city on a hill. It is now the time for paradise to be recreated, and the name of that paradise is America. Even in 1630, one of the great Anglo-Puritans, John Winthrop, finds himself again in a very famous phrase: we must consider that we shall be a city on a hill. Those of you who know St. Augustine will recognize this is the secularization of the earthly city. All the eyes of the people are upon us. My God, think of that as a kind of Puritan exceptionalism. The world is watching. This is America now being exceptional in every respect. And of course, this begins the story. What literature will apply? What voice will apply? What authorship will carry this perennial, this extraordinary idea of America? Who will create what Scott Fitzgerald at the end of The Great Gatsby will call the fresh green breast of the New World? That nutritional, lacteal idea, the Mother America, feeding its people, creating this new body, this new birth. Canonical America. Now, needless to say, many Americans were deeply anxious. The anxiety of influence was profound. And the Reverend Sidney Smith, a very austere Edinburgh cleric who founded the Edinburgh Review in 1820, said the following: in the four quarters of the globe, who reads an American book, or goes to an American play, or looks at an American painting or statue? Enough of this America, away with its exceptionalism, provincial backwater, nothing less. And one could go right the way through thinking of why it was that Henry James in the 19th century, in 1876, would write a biography of his predecessor, Nathaniel Hawthorne, lamenting what was missing in American life. No society, no state, no European sense of the world, no church, no clergy, no army. He went on and on and on listing. And William Dean Howells, his great friend, another novelist, simply replied, well, all that's left is America, which was a great reply. Very quickly, the 18th century produced two figures: Jonathan Edwards, who was the last gasp of American Calvinism, and who produced in the Treatise of Religious Affections one of the largest theological works ever produced in America, and said that at the end he had attempted to deal with the business of religion. Reverse that to the book that was most read in America in the 19th century, second only to the Bible, and you get Ben Franklin's autobiography, in which you can reverse that phrase and say that that dealt with the religion of business. So those nice two, that secular Calvinism, that Calvinist Calvinism, goes together. You can think of how Cooper created the mythology of the frontier, the spatial frontier, and you can internalize it in Poe, who turned that space inside. Very quickly they're built up, the great usual suspects: Whitman, Emerson, Thoreau, Melville, Hawthorne. It would take till the end of the 19th century before Emily Dickinson came on board, and toward the end of the 19th century, Mark Twain, Henry James. By the 1920s, with immigration becoming ever more a pressing idea, and indeed reality, a series of scholars produced texts like Lewis Mumford, The Golden Day, Van Wyck Brooks, The Flowering of New England, and in 1941, F.O. Mattheson's The American Renaissance. Finally, America had the equivalent of the figure who had dogged American authorship right the way through, namely Shakespeare. How could you get out from under this Englishman called Shakespeare and create your American Shakespeare? Other canons would come very quickly. In the 1920s, Faulkner, Hemingway, Fitzgerald. There would be a drama canon, Eugene O'Neill, Arthur Miller, Tennessee Williams. There would be a Jewish canon, Bellow, Malamud, Roth. There would be a South after Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, Carson McCullers, William Styron, Truman Capote. Now look what's missing. The entire multicultural span of America is missing at this point. And for no bad reason, the current professor of African American Studies at Harvard, Henry Louis Gates, would produce a book called Loose Canons, Notes on the Culture Wars. And it's to these others that I want to turn next. 4 arenas I want to speak about very quickly. And the one is one of the most important there is, which is Native America. Completely left out of this story, mythologized in all kinds of ways. A population today of estimated over 4 million, maybe as many as 10 million. And it stretches from the Bering Strait to the Tierra del Fuego at the bottom of South America. From Hawaii right away across to the Caribbean. It includes all of that hemispheric population of coastal and plains and woodlands, the major tribes of the Chippewa, Anishinaabe, Navajo, Cree, Laguna Pueblo, Hopi, Chickasaw, Osage, Blackfeet, and it also asks for Native Americans to be modern, to play golf, to have PhDs, to go to university. Canada is very, very similar. It has, at the moment, a likely 1.2 million indigenous people. Now, in the 1960s, released that politics of culture, not least in the creation in the 1960s of AIM, the American Indian Movement, AIM, AIM. And in 1973, the takeover of Wounded Knee and Pine Ridge Reservation. All Indians are not poor. They have massive casino and oil revenues, which have created millionaires. There is a world of urban Indians. Let me see how some voices, some native voices, played against this canonical or institutional America. William Apis, who was a Mohegan, not the last of the Mohegans, they're still around. They're still Mohegans today. William Apis produced an autobiography called The Son of the Forest in 1829, and this is what he said. I could not find the word Indian in the Bible, and therefore concluded it was a word intended for the purpose of degrading us. Luther Bear, who's Sioux, 1928, writes, My people the Sioux, it is my desire that all people know the truth about the first Americans. Now you may not know, I hope you do know, that in 1924, Native Americans were granted citizenship of the United States. It's an irony so delicious, so poignant, that one has to pause over it. Vine Deloria, one of the great activists, a lawyer, who in 1970 produced a book called Custer Died for Your Sins, great term, said to be an Indian in modern society, in a very real sense, is to be unreal and ahistorical. And how right he was. I want you to think about that. Think, in fact, how indigeneity, indigenous peoples, have been caught in that dreadful binary, on the one hand, of the noble savage, and on the other hand, the Caliban, the brute, the uncivilized figure. Even Cotton Mather, that most doughty of Anglo-American Puritans, said in 1693, the New Englanders are a people of God, settled in those lands which were once the devil's territories. So now we have devil Indians. Not difficult. Think, too, how Indians have been appropriated. Native people have been appropriated. The Boston Tea Party. This great thing when perfidious Albion, these English were finally given their eviction notice, tea-tax and all the rest of it. But they dressed up as Mohawks. People forget the costuming of that history. In 1883, Buffalo Bill started his circuses. He actually had Indians playing Indians, and he had Sitting Bull and others actually in this dazzling commercial simulation. You don't need Derrida and Baudrillard for this. You can see Indians playing Indians. And so it went on. Even in 1920, there's a picture of Calvin Coolidge, that great white father, dressed in a full Sioux war bonnet and a three-piece suit. Again, that wonderful diorama and so forth. Think, too, of whole the institutionalizations of the Indian. For example, red man chewing tobacco, most common before cigarettes became that popular. The Indian head nickel, which those of you who know American coinage will not be surprised to hear, is actually not a man at all. It's a woman with a shawl on, but it's nevertheless the Indian head nickel. Edward Curtis would do these static pictures of American Indians, vanishing American, the vanishing American. And the body of films which would follow, like, for example, in 1933, when radio first produced The Lone Ranger, with the TV series to follow, played by Jay Silverheels, and with Clayton Moore in the famous mask, "You Kimo Sabe," which turns out to mean "you trust the scout." And finally, in modern terms, the most beautiful man in America, Kevin Costner, was able to revive himself by going out to see Indians after the Civil War and to create Dances with Wolves in 1990, based on a novel by Michael Mann, who is about as native as I am, and a suicidal figure, wolf symbolism. Now, it's set in the upper plains of the Midwest, far west. They could not find enough Comanche speakers, so they produced a series of Sioux speakers, which would be like setting Jane Austen in Holland. But nobody seemed to mind because it was beautiful, and Kevin Costner finds the only captivity white woman in the entire plains of North America. How do you like your Indians? And there they are, wise, unspeaking, and so on and so on. You could go and visit Mount Rushmore. There are the statuary fathers. But round the corner, you will find a sculpture of yet another Indian leader in all kinds of ways. This is called Pahasapa. It's actually not the Black Hills of Dakota sung by Doris Day. This is, in fact, sacred land. And there are the white fathers chiseled onto Mount Rushmore, which is not its name, and so on and so on. You could go through the literary heritage with no difficulty at all. Would you like some Hemingway Indians, who always are sentinels, unspeaking, and so forth? You could have Injun Joe in Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer. The psyche of the white settler, this dire, hideous, caved Injun, not an Indian, Injun, locked in a cave. You could have the extraordinary heroization of so many Native Americans, but also complications come to play. For example, monitored retrieval storage. Many southwestern tribes have taken nuclear waste onto their own land under what is called MRS, and ask who better to look after it. Now, how do we want our Indians? Don't we think they are the warriors of the eco movement, or are they in some way taking care of nuclear waste? And what about the great tobacco industries, which both on the East Coast and the West Coast, both in Connecticut and Washington, the state of Washington, have produced tobacco revenue? In 1968 came a momentous event in the history of Native America. Scott Momaday wrote the novel House Made of Dawn. We date the so-called Native American Renaissance, which is a difficult term at the best of times, from that book. It was the first Native American text to win a Pulitzer Prize. If you haven't read it, this is the time. Run to the bookstore before this lecture is finished. This is a major, major text in all kinds of ways, set in the Southwest, set in Pueblo America, 2 war zones, the Korean War from one Native veteran, moving into the second war zone, which is the Southwest, and the ways in which the deterritorialization of native lands took place. After that, and it's worth remembering that up to that particular novel, there have probably been about 12 novels published. Since when there are over 500? How do we deal with canons here? Whose canon is working here? James Welsh wrote Winter in the Blood and Fool's Crow, which is set in the Blackfeet reservations, and tries to recreate a Blackfeet-centered history of the so-called frontier, itself a preemptive term. Gerald Visner, someone I've worked with very closely over the years, has a kind of modern, postmodern, surreal series of books, which his novels, starting with Bear Heart, and he and I produced a book 12 years ago called Post-Indian Conversations. He will only use the word Indian in italics with small I. It's post-Indian now. We're finished with that. We're finished with that stuff. Louise Erdrich, some of you will have read The Beat Queen, Leslie Marmon Silko, particularly The Almanac of the Dead in 1991, which is a huge hemispheric novel dealing with all of the Americas. Thomas King, who has moved to Canada, taken Canadian citizenship, and is the author of Medicine River, in which his protagonist is a photographer. You remember the myth? Indians don't like having their photographs taken. Here's a photographer who's an Indian. I mean, an amazing thought. And the wunderkind of modern Native American writing, Sherman Alexie, who has written some very, very naughty books, I'm pleased to tell you, not least of which with the title The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heaven, 1993. Even the title alone should have you salivating. It is a great and wonderfully funny book. A lesser-known novelist is Betty Louise Bell, who in 1994 produced a novel called Faces in the Moon. And in it, she has a Cherokee woman, mixed blood, 1930s, Depression era, and so forth, who goes to the Oklahoma Historical Society to look at the rolls, to look at her ancestry. And she meets a rather supercilious individual who looks down on her. And she gets very angry with him. And she says the following: I am your worst nightmare. I am an Indian with a pen. Writing in that multicultural, writing in that signature, and so forth. It would not take me long to shift over to Afro-America, which I want to do very, very briefly. Starting from 1619, when that Dutch trader brought, and I quote, 20 niggers into Virginia. And running through, as I've mentioned, to Barack Obama and his inauguration in January the 20th, 2009. 400 years of it. Do I need to mention slaveholding, the Civil War, abolition, the Great Migration from the South to the North, the movement into the 60s, King's I Have a Dream in 63, Selma, which we've just re-celebrated in 65, and of course those monumental historical changes that came in 64 with the Civil Rights Act and 65 with the Voter Registration Act, the killings of Malcolm in 65, King in 68, Bobby Kennedy, etc. Let me just remind you of that writing in, that sense of trying basically to get hold of the need to produce a different voice. I go back to Frederick Douglass, who was the author of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself. I cannot stress the importance of that subtitle, written by himself. Remember, slaves were forbidden to read. If they could read, they'd write their own passes. They might escape. Heaven knows what else they might do if they could read. And he talks about stealing his ABC from his slave owner. He quotes the owner saying, and I quote back, "If you teach that nigger, speaking of myself, to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave." It was, I now understand, what had been a great perplexing mystery, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. I understood for the first time the pathway from slavery to freedom. Articulacy, the word, signature, the literary creation, the sense in which you are now going to write yourself in. And the double trope, not only of a black slave in a white-owned plantocracy, but black print on the white page. The analogy works perfectly. The inscription is all. It takes no time at all before we've moved into Richard Wright in the 1940s in Native Son, or that wonderful and great and necessary novel, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man of 1952, based, of course, on H.G. Wells' original, but using the idea of the anonymity of the black face, at least under white auspices. Look at Leroy Jones's Dutchman, that black underground play in which the circling flying Dutchman under Manhattan becomes the underbelly, the undergrowth, the under voice surfacing out, blooming out. And who better to say than Alice Walker and Toni Morrison, the Nobel Prize winner, in The Color Purple by Alice Walker, so much better than the film, and Toni Morrison's Beloved, in which the enghosted slavery which is visited on the protagonist is brought to bear. So I want to just mention one poem which summarizes some of that, and it goes back into the 1920s from Langston Hughes, who writes, "The Negro speaks of rivers." And this is the poem, and I read it to you with some feeling, I hope. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawn was young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I have seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. Take that home and love it to death. That is one of the great blues, jazz, songs, poems of African America. Let me quickly turn to Latino America. The census for 2012 tells you that there will be 38.3 million Spanish speakers and over 10 million Spanish learners in the whole of the North America. That makes it the 5th biggest Spanish-speaking country in the world. English only. Official English. Think of those pluralities of languages, of which this is obviously a major one. There are many, many others. And you begin to understand. The Chicanos, the word comes from Mexicano in Spanish to Mexicana, Ejano, Chicano, and it gets into that softer world. It is the southern west of America. Texas, California, Arizona, Nevada, which means covered in snow, Nevada, New Mexico, Nuevo Mexico. And it fuses with Nahuatl and with Atlan, these incredible indigenous ancestries and so forth. Take Puerto Riqueño and the Spanish-American War, which also gave America the Philippines. If you wish to read this wonderful text, you can look at Judith Kofer's The Latin Delhi and Other Stories, which came out in '93, which juxtaposes the island of Puerto Rico with urban Puerto Rico in North America, in which she lives in a thing called El Building, which might stand for all of tenement Puerto Rico, and is set, among other things, and refers to a place called Loicida, which is the Spanish pronunciation for the Lower East Side. So we now have a new place in all kinds of ways. Cuban America comes into play. What better than Oscar Hijuelas' The Mambo Kings Play Songs of Love? You can almost sing the title. Exhilarating narrative of the Cuban musician brothers Cesar and Nestor Castillo, and is set in pre-Fidel Latin Cuba. It brings the mambo, which was had to be banned in various places, into North America, the sexuality of the mambo. And the mentor for these two is Desi Arnaz of I Love Lucy. Hello, Lucy. This kind of wonderful parodic voice that came in. Sandra Cisneros, the author of The House on Mango Street and Woman Hollering Creek and Other Stories, has a wonderfully useful account of her Englishness. She talks about her mother who was English-speaking, her father who was Spanish-speaking. My mother's English was learned in the Mexican-Italian neighborhood she grew up in Chicago's near side, and English learned from playmates and school. My father, on the other hand, spoke to us in a Spanish of grandfathers and children, a language embroidered with the diminutive. These two voices at odds with each other, curiously, are the voices that surface in my writing. That plurality of voice, once again. There is a poem by a Chicano poet that I want to just mention, Carlos Campion, and he writes a poem which I think Aztlán is the mythic homeland of the Chicanos, the ones who came up from Mexico, settled in the Southwest, went back to Mexico, founded Mexico City, but kept up that mythological place, that homeland of Latinos, the Chicanos. And this is his poem, Carlos Campion. He's a Chicago-based poet. Today, I thought I'd call home, so I got on the telephone and said, "Operator, please give me Aztlán, person to person." After 2 minutes, she asked me to spell it. So I did, A-Z-T-L-A-N. She thought I said Iceland. What? Aztlán? She said, "Is this some kind of joke?" I said, "No, you know where it is." She said, "Sir, I cannot take this call, but if you wish, I'll let you talk to my supervisor." I said, "Fine, put him on, I got time." Well, the supervisor got on the line and I told her that what I'd said before. And all she could say was, that's the first time she'd ever heard about it. I said, "You'll hear more about it soon," and hung up. We've been hearing about Latinos and Latino American writing since and before, indeed. And Campion, again, brings that multicultural imperative into the play. Quickly, I must move into Asian American literature. Huge, composite, massive field, which I can only give some brief annotations of. But remember, for the first time, Americans were confronted with something very different. Hitherto, so it was thought, America had been an Atlantic civilization, Anglo-America, Europe-America, whatever, but it had been the Atlantic. Now the Pacific was suddenly in play. And by the year 2050, on every demographic estimate that we have, the combined Asian American population of America will make it, and I say this carefully, the largest minority compositely in the whole of the country. There will be no one presiding ethnicity in America. The backdrop is familiar to many of you. The insidious and scandalous yellow peril phobia, the blight of Orientalism. We need Edward Sayid just to remind ourselves. We have to remember for Chinese America, the 1892 Exclusion Act, making sure that, yes, men could work on the railways and dig the minerals and so on, but they could not bring women because if they did, surprise, surprise, biologically women had children. So we could not have any Chinese Americans. So the image was railway man, laundry man, which was not a Chinese story at all, and pigtails. In 1924, the Immigration Act, very famous Immigration Act, not only aimed to keep more Chinese out, but also Eastern Europeans who were not white. I mean, they spoke Slavic languages. Surely that's an evidence they weren't white. And it was proposed by that man of the people, Henry Cabot Lodge, one of the great white fathers of modern America. Japanese America, I heard daily say in this room, who first came to Hawaii, and then into other Americas, from Canada to Peru to Brazil, and of course down the West Coast. Pearl Harbor, and the iniquity signed by FDR of Executive Order 9066, which put 120,000 Japanese Americans into those internment camps, Manzanar and many others. One of the tragedies, among many tragedies that attained from that, was the mythology that all of these Japanese Americans were spies for the emperor, for Japan. There were indeed Japanese American spies. They were spying for America in Japan. Not a story ever known. And the historians have shown there was not a single act of treason committed by any Japanese American in America. And not for nothing did it take till Bill Clinton came along to apologize for that iniquity. There were 22,000 Japanese Canadians put into camps in Canada. There were over 15,000 put in Peru and Chile. Yellow peril was alive and well in the most literal senses. Filipino America, which will become the largest of the Asian American communities, as the demographics seem to predict, brings us up to the only literal US colony, namely in the 1898 Spanish-American War, and of course the sending in of the Marines, and on it goes. It's also worth pointing out that the Philippines has the largest concentration of overseas North Americans in the world. There is no place in the world that has more North Americans centered in it than the Philippines, partly military, partly economic, etc. And Korean America brings us into natural man, not only the Koreatowns and so forth, but the division at the 38th parallel and that hideous war which still continues to haunt. I can add the Vietnamese and many, many others of the South Asian, plus all of South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, etc., etc. But I want to use two quotations just to help us out a little bit here. Maxine Hong Kingston, in The Woman Warrior, Memoirs of a Girlhood Among Ghosts in 1977, that Chinatown, San Francisco upbringing, and Berkeley, and the 1960s, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, the whole works, remembers learning her Chinese and juxtaposing her Chinese with her English language. And she uses this phrase, "I could not understand I. The Chinese I has 7 strokes, intricacies. How could the American I, assuredly wearing a hat like the Chinese, have only 3 strokes, the middle so straight?" Chinese kanji character I, Western I. The plurality of that I is crucial to the same story I'm trying to insist upon. And Meena Alexander, who was raised in Kerala, comes from India, becomes an established writer, writes a wonderful autobiography called The Shock of Arrival, talks about her ethnic identity as an Indian American. I'm using Indian here as from the country of India. "I learned from Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, Jewish Americans, Arab Americans, and my artwork reflects these lines of sense, these multiple anchorages." What a great phrase. These multiple anchorages. What an incredibly honorable tribute to the plurality of America. And Frank Wu, another Chinese-American writer who produced a book in 2002 called Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White, again attacking model minority, all Asians work hard, or all nerds, are all going to be IT geniuses, etc., etc. He says the following: "People speak of American as if it means white and minority, as if it means black. People speak of America as if it means white and minority as if it means black. In that semantic formula, Asian Americans, neither black nor white, consequently are neither American nor a minority." It's a nice point in all kinds of ways. You don't need me to remind you of some of the incredible tributes that have taken place. Amy Tan's Joy Luck Club in 1985 with those mother-daughter pairings and that mahjong table, which becomes the metaphor of interchange and both gender, ethnicity, history, the Pacific, Han China, modern America, those exchanges that take place. And for those of you who are teaching here, to have the privilege of teaching Toshio Mori, Yokohama, California, which was in 1949 a series of short stories very akin to Sherwood Anderson's Weinberg's Ohio, and dare I say, James Joyce's Dubliners. And put that along with Yamamoto's 17 Syllables, which you hardly need me to gloss, another series which was made into a PBS series of films, which looks at the lives of Japanese Americans, both under the internment and post-internment in the West Coast. We also have that great Filipino American bad girl, Jessica Hagedorn, in the novel Dog Eaters, which is what, of course, a very famous French diplomat referred to Filipinos as being. They were dog eaters, which tells you plenty in its own self. And it takes shot at the Marcos years. It looks at Spanish colonial Catholicism. It looks at U.S. Popular culture. And it has in it the presiding figure of Imelda, who she refers to as Madame Galactica. Madame Galactica. Wonderfully irreverent, clever, witty, stylish, again, writing in. The key anthologies we can turn to are ones by Jessica Hagedorn. Charlie Chan is Dead. Charlie Chan is Dead, an anthology of contemporary Asian American fiction. That blustering, hobbled Charlie Chan figure, played invariably by white actors and barely speaking English, talking sing-song Chinese English, etc. A real racist travesty, which has been attacked by Frank Chin and others. And Garrett Hongel, who is a Japanese-American playwright, who produced the collection of essays called Under Western Eyes. You will know from your Conrad that that is in fact a phrase readjusted in all kinds. So let me draw to a conclusion with one or two observations. I want to cite Leroy Jones, perhaps one of the most militant black voices, who became Imamu Amiri Baraka when he Islamized his life and his name, in a poem called Numbers and Letters. He says, "I can't say who I am until you agree I'm real. You can't have the myths until you agree I'm real. Nor in anything I've said do I wish for 1 second to turn the received canon of American literature into dead white males. I think it's a lazy and stupid term and it should be dropped. I want to use two figures now, a figure who's been very important in my literary life, Herman Melville, and a second figure who I'll come to in just 1 second. In his fourth novel, Redburn, written in 1849, Melville says the following: "You cannot spill a drop of American blood without spilling the blood of the whole world. We are not a narrow tribe of men. No, our blood is at the flood of the Amazon, made up of 1,000 noble currents pouring into one. Our ancestry is lost in the universal paternity, and Caesar and Alfred, Paul and Luther, Homer and Shakespeare are as much ours as Washington, who is as much the world's as our own." If that isn't a statement of multicultural historicity, I don't know what is. That's 1849 and it's Herman Melville. A second voice that I want to bring into the consideration is this. Randolph Bourne, WASP, 1920s, one of the great essayists in American history, who produced an essay, very famous essay for the Atlantic Monthly, 1916, called Transnational America. It should be required reading for anybody who wants to study America. America is a unique sociological fabric, he writes, and it bespeaks poverty of imagination not to be thrilled at the incalculable potentialities of so novel a union, to seek no other goal than the weary old nationalism, belligerent, exclusive, inbreeding, is to make patriotism a hollow sham. Boy, we could do with reading that aloud in certain quarters right this second. And finally, I want to come to a figure who's been extremely important again in my life, partly out of friendship, partly out of a whole range of things. Ishmael Reed, who got one of the MacArthur Foundation grants recently and was responsible for two anthologies, the Before Columbus Foundation fiction and the Before Columbus Foundation poetry anthology. And I can be personal to a certain extent. 16 years ago, I wrote a book called Multicultural American Fiction, and it covers all of this waterfront and more, and is indeed now translated into Japanese. And I was attacked by a quarter which I was very proud to be attacked by some neo-Nazi in Amazon who told me that I hated whiteness. And the quality of mind that produced that criticism seems to me to speak volumes. To be attacked for hating whiteness because of my name and its supposed affinity with the Civil War dead, which he doesn't have, he somehow felt I was a guardian of the true way going back to the Confederacy. An extraordinary kind of confusion in his own way. Now, in his introduction to these two anthologies, Ishmael Reed writes as follows, and it's a note on which I want very much to conclude. "I began to realize that being black or Chicano or Native American You are forced to see and be aware of disparate cultures. We had to become multicultural, and I think this will be a major factor in determining who finally survives in this country. It's like evolution. Imagine the fundamentalists reading this. It's like evolution. If you have a limited viewpoint, you're at a disadvantage. Those who have incorporated other perspectives and allowed their vision to embrace other ways of looking at the world have a better chance of surviving. Multiculturalism as evolution, as creative Darwinism, as a form in which America could evolve into a parity of voices, an interchange of authorships. What an extraordinary thing to say. Keep your Melville in mind as well. 19th century, 20th century. This has not changed in any way whatsoever. So, to draw those threads into one might talk of all canons in contention, all transnationalisms in contention, a nation of multi-canons, a nation of not one but many multiculturalisms, multiculturalisms within multiculturalism. This is not a cacophony. This is not Babel, not at all. It is simply a series of, if you like, of dialectics which connect one into the other. And America is all the better for it. The world is all the better for it. And we are all the better for it. Thank you.